For centuries, philosophers have searched for a clean biological or cognitive boundary to separate humans from the rest of the natural world. Look at this biological taxonomy tree. Historically, the goal was to draw a strict line right here, around Homo sapiens, often justified by Immanuel Kant's concept of rational personhood, the idea that only beings capable of self-reflective, normative reasoning possess inherent moral worth. But empirical research collapsed that boundary. When ethologists like Jane Goodall documented chimpanzees displaying complex grief over the death of a family member, it became clear that traits once thought exclusively human, like social problem-solving, deep emotional bonds, and episodic memory, are shared across the species barrier. This cognitive and emotional overlap extends far beyond our closest primate relatives. Recent scientific reviews on sentience, the capacity to experience feelings like pain and pleasure, have established evidence for moral status in highly phylogenetically distant animals, including octopuses, insects, and decapod crustaceans. Tying moral status strictly to advanced rational capacity introduces a fatal logical flaw. If self-reflective reasoning is the absolute requirement to avoid being treated as a mere object, that standard excludes human infants, people in comas, and those with severe cognitive impairments. This is known in the literature as the problem of marginal cases. Because biological traits and cognitive capacities are distributed so messily across nature, using mere species membership or a high bar of rationality to grant or deny moral status is a philosophically untenable position. This brings us to the concept of moral considerability. Think of this as a moral radar screen. To say a being is morally considerable, like this single blip appearing here, is simply to say it is a being that can be wronged. It has crossed the baseline threshold, requiring us to take its existence into account. But considerability is distinct from moral significance. Knowing a being is on the radar tells us nothing about how to weigh its claims when it collides with dozens of other signals. To resolve these collisions, we have to determine two things. First, we must define what an animal's actual interests are. Second, we have to stress test how competing ethical frameworks handle high-stakes conflicts between those interests. Getting on the moral radar is only the prerequisite. The rigorous work of applied ethics lies entirely in calculating the weight of those blips when they crash into each other. To know how to treat a morally considerable being, we first have to establish an axiology. An axiology is a value theory that defines the specific criteria for what makes a life go well or badly for that being. The first major approach is hedonism. In contemporary animal ethics, hedonism reduces the concept of a good life strictly to maximizing pleasure and minimizing biological pain. If pain is the only negative metric, strict hedonism leads to distinct policy implications. Faced with a vast volume of agricultural suffering in factory farming, some proponents of this theory argue that genetically engineering pain-free livestock becomes a moral imperative, as it eliminates the only bad thing recognized by the framework. The second approach is preference satisfaction. Instead of focusing solely on biological pain states, this axiology argues that well-being consists of fulfilling an individual's subjective desires and goals. This creates an immediate epistemic challenge. Animals subjected to millennia of human domestication have been selectively bred for docility. Determining their true preferences is difficult when those desires may have been formed under manipulative, non-autonomous conditions. The third approach avoids subjective desires entirely. Objective list theories, like the capability approach developed by Martha Nussbaum, argue that flourishing requires specific objective goods, such as bodily integrity, the ability to play, and social affiliation, regardless of whether the animal subjectively desires them. The choice of axiology is the critical first variable. Whichever value theory we adopt dictates what actually counts as a harm, altering the baseline data we feed into any ethical calculation. Once we know what interests are at stake, we need a framework to adjudicate them.
The first is animal rights theory, heavily associated with Tom Regan, where a moral claim acts as an absolute barrier against instrumental use. Under a strict rights framework, using an animal as a mere means to a human end is an intrinsic violation. Calculating aggregate utility is irrelevant. When a right is violated, it immediately generates forward-looking duties, requiring moral agents to provide reparations or change the systems that cause the harm. This map illustrates the Zoopolis model, developed by Sue Donaldson and Will Kymlicka. They modify traditional rights theory by arguing that specific rights should scale based on the historical and spatial relationships humans have forced upon animals. They propose 3 political tiers. Domesticated animals, forced into dependence with us, are owed the status of citizens, guaranteeing care and access. Liminal animals living on the urban periphery, like raccoons, are denizens, owed secure residency. And wild animals are granted sovereignty, protecting their territories against human colonization. Rights-based frameworks resolve ethical conflicts not by weighing mathematical utility, but by establishing absolute jurisdictional boundaries that prohibit instrumental exchange. The opposing adjudicative framework is utilitarianism, most commonly associated with Peter Singer. Here, equal interests of all morally considerable beings are considered equally, but the right action is the one that results in the greatest aggregate interest satisfaction. Look at this balancing scale. To weigh conflicting claims, utilitarians use a multi-factor perspective that categorizes interests on a scalar metric: crucial, important, replaceable, and trivial. In any conflict, a single crucial interest will always outweigh a large stack of lesser interests. We can stress test this logic with a high-stakes survival scenario. Imagine a direct conflict in a bitter Arctic environment, involving a freely roaming seal, an indigenous hunter struggling to feed his family, and a stranded explorer. First, we analyze the variables for the seal. The seal possesses a crucial interest in avoiding suffering. However, it lacks a future-directed interest in continued existence, the specific cognitive capacity to project oneself into the future, which Kantian personhood requires. Next, we look at the human actors. Both the indigenous hunter's family and the explorer possess future-directed, crucial interests in their continued existence. Applying the scalar logic to the outcome, painlessly killing the seal to satisfy the hunter's crucial survival interest does not violate a future-directed interest. Because the seal lacks that specific cognitive orientation toward its own future, prioritizing the humans becomes potentially justifiable under utilitarianism, whereas a strict rights framework would stall. The multi-factor utilitarian perspective provides a flexible, scalar math for adjudicating tragic conflicts. It deliberately avoids the cultural moralism inherent in absolute rights frameworks, adapting to specific contexts and empirical data. Yet both the utilitarian scales and the rights matrices rely on a premise that philosophers in the virtue ethics and feminine care traditions reject: the assumption of moral neutrality. Philosopher Alice Crary points out that the characteristics we look for in animals are already inside ethics. Our observations of the natural world are never purely objective. They are heavily shaped by historical institutions and existing power structures. This leads to the concept of entangled empathy, articulated by Laurie Gruen. Gruen argues that moral status is not an intrinsic property isolated in a biological vacuum. Instead, it depends deeply on the systemic, lived relations those beings have with us. The top-down, objective view of the moral radar screen only gives us data points. To actually perceive the nuances of a moral landscape, we have to adopt a grounded, first-person relational perspective, recognizing how human activity directly and indirectly limits the flourishing of other creatures. Advanced animal ethics requires a dual mechanism. We need the rigorous axiologies of rights and utility to design coherent, systemic policy. But we require relational, entangled empathy to accurately perceive the lives of the beings we are attempting to regulate.